You need to hear what one rookie ranger found nailed to a tree, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, 2 years after 3 of his co-workers vanished on a routine patrol. In May of 2009, at a backcountry substation tucked into the Cataloochee Valley of the Great Smoky Mountains, 26-year-old Ranger Emory Tackett pried open a file drawer that hadn't been touched in 2 years and found a case that was never supposed to exist. 2 miles off the section of trail someone had blacked out on every map in the station, he'd find 3 tarnished badges driven into a hemlock with iron spikes older than the park itself. This is Emory's story. The bottom drawer of the surplus cabinet wouldn't give. Emory wedged a flathead into the seam and worked it back and forth, sweat sticking his collar to his neck, though the station ran cold enough to fog his breath. The lock wasn't rusted shut. It had been drilled clean and repinned by somebody who didn't want a spare key floating around. He was alone, on an unpaid late shift, cataloging gear nobody had touched in years, because Della, 7 months pregnant, stuck on bed rest, needed him picking up every overtime hour he could get. A gas station biscuit sat cooling on the cabinet, untouched. The creek bed outside had run bone dry for 3 weeks, the driest spring this valley had seen in a decade. The drawer split open. A water-swollen case folder from 2007 slid out, marked for mandatory incineration in grease pencil. 3 names were stapled to the front page. Names that tugged at something. A plaque nobody at this station ever brought up. He almost fed it into the shredder, the way procedure called for. He would have, if the rusted staple hadn't given out and dropped 1 page face up, open to a stretch of trail blacked out in grease pen so heavy it had cracked the laminate underneath. Tucked in the folder's back sleeve, a maintenance requisition sat unread. A fresh order for iron stock and spike blanks, dated 4 days earlier, signed under Sutton Ridge's own procurement code. Emory never looked at it. He was already past it, chasing the map. The door opened. Senior Ranger Garland Sturgill crossed the room and pulled the folder from under him before Emory finished a sentence. Sector 4 wasn't his business, Garland said. Then, unasked, he reminded Emory his hiring paperwork still sat in provisional review. A detail Emory hadn't brought up, and Garland had no clean reason to know. Garland cut the lights, said there was nothing back there but bad footing and old rumors. He never asked why the drawer had been drilled shut. He never asked how a rookie 2 years in had gotten it open. Emory wrote the coordinates on the back of his hand in ballpoint before he could talk himself out of it. Della's due date sat 31 days off. One wrong question on record, with his status still provisional, could end this job before the baby came. He couldn't afford to ask permission and get told no in writing. He drove into the hollow past 2 in the morning, alone, radio off, his kit riding shotgun, and no one at home who knew where he'd gone. 2 miles down the gravel road, he let himself believe he'd pulled it off clean. Drawer open, coordinates copied, no questions asked. Then his headlights swept the lot and caught fresh tire tread in the gravel that hadn't been there when his shift started. Someone else had been at the station tonight, too. 2 miles off any marked trail, Emory's headlamp found the hemlock. 3 service badges hung driven into the bark, not tacked on but hammered deep square-shanked iron spikes older than anything in a modern maintenance shed. He counted the badge numbers twice before his hands stopped shaking enough to write them down. At the base of the tree sat 3 patrol hats, brim up, each holding a few inches of standing water, clear, cold, undisturbed. The valley hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks. He smelled it before the light settled on it. Stagnant creek water and wet iron, a smell that belonged nowhere near a hollow this dry. A battery tape recorder sat wedged between two roots, reels already spinning. He crouched next to it, close enough that the smell of old rubber and rust filled his nose along with the standing water. The tape was running footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer with every step, like whoever recorded it had been walking straight toward the microphone and never once stopped to look around. Then the footsteps on the tape stopped. A branch snapped behind him, close enough that he felt the pressure of it in his chest before the sound even finished. Emory swung his headlamp around fast, expecting eyes, expecting a shape between the trees. Nothing was there. Nothing except a fresh boot print pressed into the mud 18 inches from his own knee, toe pointed directly at his back, like somebody had been standing exactly there a second earlier and simply wasn't anymore. He didn't run. Every part of him wanted to. He forced himself upright at a normal pace, tucked the recorder under his arm without turning it off, and walked back toward the truck like a man who had somewhere ordinary to be. It was the hardest quarter-mile of his life, and every step of it he waited for a hand to close around the back of his neck. Halfway there, a detail from earlier that night surfaced in his head, small and stupid, and impossible to shake loose. Pressed into the station's supply closet doorframe, 3 brass tacks sat driven in a neat row, the kind of thing you'd walk past 100 times and file away as leftover contractor work. He hadn't thought twice about them in 2 years working that building. He thought about them now. The recorder was still running in his hand. Underneath the footsteps, quiet enough that he almost missed it, something else moved on the reel. A second layer of sound, thinner, like it had been recorded through a wall from another room entirely. He didn't stop walking to listen closer. He couldn't make himself stop, not out here, not alone. He reached the truck, threw the recorder and his kit onto the passenger seat, and sat there a full minute with both hands locked on the wheel before his fingers worked well enough to turn the key. His pulse hadn't leveled off. It wasn't going to for a while yet. Halfway down the gravel road, headlights still off, he let the last few minutes settle, the badges, the standing water, the boot print, the tape still turning in the seat beside him. He'd gotten out. He'd gotten the recorder. Whoever left it had wanted him to find it and hadn't stopped him from walking away with it. Its own kind of message he didn't have the stomach to think through yet. Then he remembered the tire tread back at the station lot. He pulled to the shoulder, killed the engine, and climbed out with his flashlight aimed at his own front tires, checking the tread against the photograph he'd snapped 20 minutes earlier at the hemlock. They matched. Exactly, tread for tread, down to the same worn patch on the outside edge. Whoever had stood 18 inches from his back in that hollow had also been parked outside the substation before Emory ever left for Sector 4, hours before he found the drawer, before his shift had even started. Whoever it was hadn't followed him into the hollow. They'd been waiting for him the whole night, and they'd known exactly where he was headed before he did. Emory worked the case on his own time, piece by piece, 3 weeks eating into every hour he wasn't on shift or sitting with Della. The toolmark match came first. In the station's own basement armory, a building erected in 1934, an unopened surplus crate held square iron spikes identical to the ones driven into the hemlock. Same shank, same hand-forged head. Somebody in this chain of command had known about those spikes since before Emory was born, and the crate had sat 20 feet below his own desk the whole time, gathering dust like ordinary hardware. The requisition slip came next. Cross-checking supply logs against the folder, Emory finally landed on the page he'd skimmed past his first night. A fresh order for iron stock and spike blanks, dated 4 days before he'd even opened that drawer, signed under Garland's own procurement code. His stomach dropped reading it. The threat wasn't buried in 2007. It was current. It was close. It had a name on the paperwork, and the name was somebody he ate lunch with. Retired dispatcher Vesta Holcomb still lived at the base of the ridge, 70-some years old, sharp as a tack and twice as wary. She played him an unlogged dispatch reel from 2007, the 3 missing Rangers calm as Sunday, reading off weather conditions for a storm system that wouldn't reach the region until 2009. 40 seconds later, they went off comms for good. Then the tape cut, no warning, into a second recording layered underneath the first. Emory's own voice, reading that same weather report in a conversation he had no memory of ever having. His hands went cold on the arms of the chair. Vesta swore on her husband's grave she'd never touched that tape. She unplugged the machine before he could ask her to play it again, her fingers missing the cord twice. "Don't ask her a second time," she told him. "Whatever's on there doesn't repeat itself for the same person twice." And the last ranger who heard it died inside the week. In the case folder, water-stained but legible, sat a line from a prior investigator's field log, underlined twice in ballpoint. If they ask you to burn it, that's when you make a copy first. It stuck in Emory's head that night when Garland leaned against his desk and, almost gently, suggested he hand the whole file back and let it go, for his own good. He didn't confront Garland with the requisition slip. Instead, he photographed it in the empty station bathroom, printed a copy on the back office machine after hours, and mailed the physical page to Della's home address. Off the property, off the grid, insured against anyone deciding to make it disappear. He told Garland nothing about it. Watching the envelope drop into the box, he believed the evidence was finally safe, no matter what happened to him next. To buy himself one clear night alone in Sector 4, he also told Garland he was chasing a lead 2 ridges over. A lie that felt small at the time, the kind of thing a rookie tells a supervisor to get a little breathing room. He didn't know Garland's people read outgoing mail from that same station box. Standard procedure he'd forgotten was standard the moment he needed it not to be. 2 counties away, in an office Emory would never see, someone circled his name on a mail log and made a phone call. His safe copy hadn't protected anything. It had told them exactly what he had, and how many days remained before the district auditor purged the last of the 2007 files for good. The station door had started sticking in its frame that week, swollen shut no matter how dry the season stayed. And twice now Emory had walked a stretch of the Sector 4 access trail he knew by heart and come out somewhere he didn't recognize. He wrote both off as nothing worth mentioning. He felt closer than he'd ever been. Copy mailed, lead bought, 3 weeks of work finally about to pay off. He went back to the armory one last time before he ran, and that was his mistake. The crate from the 1930s sat open on the workbench, lid pried off, spikes counted out in a neat row across the wood. 3, then a gap, then a 4th. Fresh, engraved. His own badge number pressed into the iron shank in tight digits. 314. Somebody had done it recently enough that metal shavings still sat curled in the grooves, bright against the dull old iron around them. Emory didn't touch it. He grabbed the file, grabbed his kit, and left the lights burning behind him. He drove for the state police barracks 2 counties over, alone, radio off, the case folder riding the passenger seat like it might shift and slide out the door on its own. He'd told Garland a lie about a lead 2 ridges over. He'd trusted a mailbox with his only insurance. Both decisions sat in his chest now like stones he couldn't put down. Fog came into the hollow with no front behind it, no cold snap, nothing on the radio to explain it. Just a wall of white rolling across the road, thick enough to swallow his headlights whole, 30 feet out and closing. He slowed. He didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. At the unlit crossing on Route 284, an unmarked utility truck ran the stop at 40 miles an hour and took the driver's side of his Jeep clean off its frame. Glass, a sound like the whole world folding in half, then nothing but the engine ticking somewhere below him and the taste of copper filling his mouth. He was upside down. The belt had him by the shoulder, cutting deep enough that his arm had already gone numb below the strap. Blood ran backward up his face into his hairline, pooling there, dripping onto the crushed roof beneath him. He tried his legs. They moved. He tried the buckle. His fingers wouldn't close around it, not the first time, not the second. Somewhere outside, footsteps started in the wet leaves. Not running, not hurrying at all. Slow even, unbothered. The walk of a man who already knew exactly how this ended and had no reason to rush toward it. Emory stopped fighting the belt. He listened instead, every part of him gone still except his heart, doing something violent and fast against his ribs. The steps got closer, close enough that he could hear mud pulling at the treads with each footfall. A shape crossed what was left of his headlight beam, boots dark and wet to the ankle, the same tread he'd photographed at the base of the hemlock 3 weeks earlier. The shape crouched at the shattered window. A gloved hand came through the broken glass first, fingers thick, knuckles scarred old and white, and closed around Emory's throat before he found the air to make a sound. The grip wasn't rushed. It found the exact pressure it wanted and held there, patient, professional, like the hand had done this before, and knew precisely how much room a man needed to keep breathing without being able to speak. Diesel and wet wool filled the air between them, layered under the copper already thick in his mouth. Somewhere behind the hand, breath moved slow and even, entirely unbothered by any of this. A voice came low, almost gentle, close enough that Emory felt the words more than heard them. "You mailed it," the voice said. "That's how we knew you had it." 4 words and the whole night rearranged itself. The empty mailbox at Della's house had never been safe. It had been the exact moment they'd learned what he knew and how much time was left to act. His own careful, clever move. The one thing he'd been sure would protect him no matter what happened next, had been the signal the entire time. The hand tightened, just enough that black crept in around the edges of what he could still see. Somewhere behind the shape at the window, a second set of footsteps started up the ravine, unhurried, carrying something that scraped against the rocks with a metal sound he recognized before his vision gave out completely. It was the same sound the spikes had made, sliding loose from the crate. Cold iron pressed into his open palm. Fingers not his own folded his around the shank of a 5th spike, guiding his hand closed around it like they wanted his prints on it before whatever came next. The grip on his throat eased just once, just long enough for one full breath. "Almost there," the voice said, quiet as a secret. Emory understood, in the half-second before the dark closed all the way in, that the voice wasn't talking to him at all. Then nothing. The official report called it an unwitnessed single-vehicle rollover, driver fatigue, no other party involved. No second truck, no missing case file, no mention of Sector 4 anywhere in the paperwork. Emory read it twice from a hospital bed, with a cervical collar locked around his neck and a set of handcuffs, standard for any injury involving a federal vehicle, chaining his wrist to the rail. Della visited every day that week. She mentioned it almost in passing, folding his laundry at the foot of the bed. The envelope he'd mailed her had never shown up. She'd checked the box every morning without fail. Nothing had ever come, and nothing ever would. When he was finally steady enough to drive, he went straight to Vesta's place and asked her outright about the layered recording, the second voice underneath his own. She didn't flinch, answering. The second voice on those old station tapes, she told him, had always belonged to whoever opened that drawer next. Not a warning meant for him specifically. A roll the hollow handed to a name, over and over, no matter who happened to be wearing badge 314 that particular year. It didn't explain why. It only explained that it kept happening, and had been happening long before Emory ever showed up for his first shift, and would keep happening long after he was gone. 2 weeks later, he sat back at his desk, collar still on, feeding the last of the 2007 duplicate manifests through the shredder himself. Garland hadn't said a word about any of it, and neither had he. The auditor's purge date had come and gone. Whatever had been in that drawer was gone for good now, by Emory's own hand, and no record existed anywhere that any of it had ever been real. On his way out that evening, he stopped by the supply closet door out of old habit, the way he had every night for 2 years without thinking about it. The 3 brass tacks were still driven into the frame at eye level, right where they'd always been. Beside them sat a 4th, hammered in clean, at exactly the height of his own badge. He touched it once. He didn't ask anyone about it, and he already knew nobody would give him an answer if he did. The station had gone still around him in a way that took him a second to place. No hum from the shredder motor, no traffic on the county road, none of the usual evening racket the building made settling into the dark. He stood in the doorway and listened for it anyway, the way a man listens for a phone that might still ring. 2 damp boot prints sat drying on the tile by the door, fresh enough that the edges hadn't lifted yet. It hadn't rained in 6 weeks. Emory looked at the prints a long moment. Then he locked the station, got in his truck, and drove home to Della without saying a word to anyone about Sector 4, that drawer, or what he'd found nailed to a hemlock 2 years after 3 other men went looking for the same answers he had. He never brought it up again. Not to Garland. Not to Della. Not to the next rookie who'd eventually inherit that surplus cabinet and the drawer that wouldn't quite stay locked. Some files don't burn. They just wait for the next name.